you give the Tudor party credit for its ability to create or to cultivate a social base or a class base for itself. But you make two other arguments, and I would like you to elaborate on those. One, you asked this question that why was it that during this period, no other political parties were able to connect with any other social class? And secondly, you criticize to the party for not taking the peasantry seriously. And you, at least my reading of your work is that you somehow, at least implicitly, argue that that may be the cause of their political failure. Can you elaborate on those two issues?
Well, I mean, clearly the social basis is very much urban. So that raises the question, why did it not become much more of a mass-based also in the countryside? And that raised actually the question how much it was the fault or shortcomings of the Tudeh party, how much was it basically the structural system of the countryside that explains that. And you find actually, two answers to that. To be able to go into the countryside from the city, you needed the opportunity and the time. It's not something you can't just go into the village and put a sign there saying, peasants of the world unite and peasants are going to rally behind you. You need some sort of links, people who know the countryside and so on. And also the political opportunity to do that. And there were actually, after the dissertation, when I looked back, there were two periods where actually the Tudeh party did have the quite short opportunity to do it. One was in 1946 and one was in 1953. And they did take the advantage of that opportunity. And they were actually surprisingly quite successful. You find now in especially the British documents that they did actually quite successfully in the villages around Isfahan, Tabriz, did succeed in mobilizing peasants. But that was cut short like a guillotine because that political opening, closed very quickly. But then the other question is, how come there was not much more peasant activities, even besides the Tudeh party? And that led actually for me and Farhad Kazemi, we did a piece, I don't know if you've seen that, on the non-revolutionary peasantry.
Yes, I have seen.
So that the question you raised led us to look at actually the countryside and why in Iran there was no peasant basically participation, with the exception of Gilan perhaps, but in about 19th and 20th century, there was really no peasant, you can say, mass movements. And that led us to actually look at other peasant movements. And I think the answer there is, which we came up with, was Eric Wolf's answer, that to have a peasant movement, you need a middle peasantry, because the poor peasantry are basically too much under the control of the powers that be. And of course, rich peasants are going to identify with the establishment. So you need a middle peasantry that has some leeway to be able to protest and mobilize. And the countryside in Iran, both in the 19th, 20th century, was such there were very little middle peasantry there to give the basis for peasant uprisings. So I think the answer of why there was no the Tudeh expansion into the countryside, partly because of the political organizational limitations, and partly basically, or mostly, due to what was happening in the countryside.
Well, this is great. And I was actually thinking of that piece that you wrote with Farhad Kazemi. And if you don't mind, I want to now ask a broader question about the peasantry. And that is that, so it wasn't just to the party, right? So during the constitutional revolution, the constitutionalists rarely raised issues of land reform or really horrible situation of the peasants. We don't see that. We don't see that during the constitutional revolution. Reza Shah's reform also does not address land tenure, or he certainly does not engage in a sort of national land reform program. And it seems that almost all social forces in Iran sort of either ignore or they are not able to address this issue. I raise this issue because I'm sure that you must have read this piece by Anne Lambton about this. It's a short piece, but I think it's an important piece that Anne Lambton argues that this is the major shortcoming of the constitutional revolution, because sociologically, she argues, that is the causes of all the problems in Iran. So if one want to look at the larger, broader modern history of Iran, it's not just the Tudeh party. It just seems that none of the social forces, including governmental and non-governmental forces, sort of ignore the peasantry. I understand, and your explanation about the sort of landlord having absolute hold on peasantry is one way of looking at this. But on the other hand, again, in the Constitutional Revolution, one goes and reads all the documents, you don't see much programs for this sector of the society. There is a very interesting piece that Taghi Arani writes about the basically class analysis of Iranian society, and he also basically argues that there is no hope with the peasantry. So I'm wondering whether this was not a big gap, a big problems in Iranian politics that could have provided to the party a big opportunity, bigger than even one may think, because everybody else ignored a very, very hard situation of majority of Iranian people, because as you know, Iran was even in the 40s mainly a non-urban society.
Well, I think if you look at sort of the political discourse from the Mashrutiyat onwards, the issue of, often it was raised, feudalism was there. You know, this wouldn't be just socialist radicals. Even liberals would argue that Iran is backward because it's feudal. So that implicitly meant basically that the countryside, the peasantry or the serfs were basically under a feudal system, and that had to change. But why there was no more, they can say, focus on it,
or systematic program for that.
Yes, program, is I think it goes back to a larger issue I try to deal with, is if you don't have a state, political structure, organizations, how are you going to actually carry out land reform? One way would be to incite peasants to rebellion and basically lynch your local landlord.
Like in America, this happened.
Or it happened in 1917 in Bolshevik Russia. But most, of course, political parties would do that. In the Tudeh party, at some point, actually in 46 and 53, we're talking about these type of actions. But on the whole, reformers realized that since you have no institutions, centralized institutions, that you could carry out a drastic land reform to eliminate feudalism, the best you could do was actually what Mossadegh came up with, to increase the share of the crop going to the peasants at the cost of the landlord. And that was actually Mossadegh's land reform in 1953. And that was a practical way of doing it if you don't have the machinery to do it. Later, of course, the Shah, after this centralized government was established, could do it with a white revolution. But that came much, much, much later in the 1960s. But before that, it would have been really impossible to carry out from the center drastic land redistribution if you didn't have the mechanism to do it. And I think that was a realistic thing that most political parties took into account.
It seems that you believe that the problem was not that, so in this case, to the party, or in the case of constitutional revolution, the constitutionalists did not have an adequate analysis of or view of the Iranian sociological reality, right? Because certainly during, if it is, we speak about the constitutional revolution, we are talking about a large number of people, most of the society. In other words, the argument that Anne Lambton makes that if it was her, she would make land reform first, then constitutional revolution.
How are you going to carry out land reform? You know, there's no machinery. What you're going to pass a law saying peasants own the land, but how are you going to actually implement that?
I obviously don't want to argue with you or make this a big issue, but the argument is that the constitutionalists really were partly part of the government, right? In other words, if they were able to convince Muzaffaruddin Shah to sign the constitution that limits his own power, they could have included some clause there on land reform. No, you don't think that would be possible?
I don't think that would have been effective.
Certainly Reza Shah could have done it.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, sorry.
Two things. We recently had this conversation with Ali. I came across a writing by Taghi-Zadeh in the late 1950s. And he said in that piece that as a member of the Social Democratic Party, the Democrat Party, one of his biggest dreams from the time of the Constitution had been to see the master-peasant relationship be abrogated and to have land reform. So this is explicitly from the mouth of one of the leaders of the Constitutional Revolution. Moreover, I think Professor Lambton had not seen material that has since her time come up, since the time of her paper. We have good evidence that Sultanzadeh called for land reform and the abrogation of big land ownership and to kind of publicize, to make public transportation, fisheries, and land ownership. The first communist party in Iran also had land reform on its agenda. This is before 1920. And even Lenin seems to have supported this. And despite some other members of the Soviet party, Soviet government, and he apparently had the support of Bukharin on this. And then Pavlovich had given an assignment to Sultanzadeh to work on the theses. I think it is very important that the machinery didn't exist, but the idea did exist. In the same way that the machinery for implementing legal reform did not exist in a way that it existed after Galvan, for example. But the idea did exist. The idea of the Edalat Khane did exist. So I think Anne Lambton is incorrect in her generalization. And we have abundant, and I'm just looking at some of the material as we speak. Haydar Khan Amoglu was against land reform, whereas Sultanzadeh was in favor of it. And we know that there is some kind of ousting of Sultanzadeh from the leadership and the takeover by Haydar Khan Amoglu in the process.
But Hossein Jan, this doesn't actually, the fact that Taghi-Zadeh, so many years after, just says something is not evidence.
I'm giving you evidence from Sultanzadeh and the proceedings of the first Communist Party conference.
I don't think that Anne Lambton is saying nobody ever thought of this. The idea is that we had these important movement, the constitutional revolution. This was a movement that made a major change. But part of their project was not land reform. This is what she's talking about. Or the fact that there was a Reza Shah, head of a state, created a centralized state, ruled Iran for almost 2 decades. And he did not, and Taghisade, of course, was a major political figure there. And there was basically nothing done in this area. This is what the argument is. The argument is not that no Iranian ever thought of this. And also, of course, what you are mentioning are mainly radicals. A good example, and Ervand does talk about this in the book and in the dissertation, is that there is very little evidence that Tudeh party mobilized its resources to address this issue, or their members of parliament, or when they were in the cabinet, they pushed for land reform.
No, actually, I mean, there, again, the opportunity, when there is an opening opportunity, you do find that there is actually, the memoirs of actually Ansari, who was head of the Tudeh peasant organizations, is quite informative about how especially in 52, 53, they did make a really concerted effort to go into the countryside.
Did something happen during this time that they...
It was opportunity. I mean, it was the Mossadegh period. There was an opening. They could go. Earlier, if they went to the countryside, especially in, let's say, during 1949-50, they would have been clamped down and so on. So it was you can say, the political police opening to able to go to the countryside. But I think there's another, more sociological issue. In areas, in countries where you do get a peasant participation, the impetus actually comes from the peasantry itself. So, for instance, often people think Mao Zedong really created the peasant revolts in China. They were peasant revolts there. All he did was he linked up the Communist Party with what they were indigenous peasant rebellions. And this made it basically a revolution. My argument was there was nearly no impetus from the peasantry. And there you have to look at the peasant, the constructor of the villages, to try to explain why there was lack of that. So it's easier to say, well, to blame either the members of parliament or the Tudeh party for not taking interest. The interest was often there. The opportunity wasn't there, but also more important, again, this goes into sort of more political sociology. What was it about the countryside that in Iran you don't see peasant uprisings earlier, except with the exception of Gilan? So that becomes, I think, the sociological issue, a problem to try to solve. But for Lambton, she was very basically contemptuous of Iranian politicians or of politics. So it's easy for her to say, well, if they had taken more interest in the peasants, there would have been a very different structure or different outcome. But that I don't think really answers the question of why there wasn't. But I think you're right. In terms of thinking, it's not that people didn't realize this was not an issue. Is the question, how can you implement any type of reform? Yeah. And interesting, Arsène Joannet, of course, goes back. He was even in the 1940s talking about land reform, but he couldn't implement it until there was the ministries of agriculture that could actually to enforce such a distribution.
Yeah, there was also a discussion during Reza Shah. Some politicians tried to encourage him to engage, but
Reza Shah is basically, he made a bargain with the upper class. So you can see in the villages.
Also became a big landowner.
Yeah, but also he made a political tacit agreement with the landed class. And you can see this in the villages. Before, Kat Khudas were invariably elected by actually local villagers. Under him, the Kharkodabas became basically nominated by the government, and invariably was the person appointed, basically named by the local big landlord. So the Kharkodab became the representative of the upper class, not of the village.
So if you don't mind, I have my last question about the Tudeh party in 41, 53, as a follow-up to this sort of political sociology of Iran during this period. So when one look at the leadership of the Tudeh party, there are a couple of things that seems rather remarkable, right? One is that the leadership is highly educated elite of both the Qajar period and Reza Shah period. These are people who are, many of them are doctors and have PhDs, or they are from, like Suleiman Mirza, from Qajar royal family, and very well known, and of course very well respected. But also there are figures of non-Muslims or from if you want to call that, Persian ethnicity. And this was very successful overall. And this, in some respect, one can argue, was very unique, because I personally have always wondered the sort of almost exclusive monopoly of attracting almost all intellectuals. By intellectuals, I mean, broadly speaking, writers and authors and scholars, but also artists of this period. They were all in one way or other, at least partly, they were attracted to the party. Certainly your book, you discuss this. Do you want to share your thoughts on this for us?
I grappled with this question, why they have such success, especially from 41 onwards among the intelligentsia. I think the answer I would come up with is that the Tudeh party very much acted in the tradition of the Mashrutiyat. In fact, if you look at their publications at that time, they're very nostalgic, very laudatory of the constitutional revolution.
Some of them were constitutionalists.
Yes, yeah. And then you look at the program in 1941-42, it really stresses the principles of the Mashrutiyat, of the Enlightenment. And if you look at the clause, I think the second clause of the party program was inalienable rights of speech, of organization, of writing, of religion. These were all Enlightenment principles. So the idea of individual rights was very much concept that the intelligentsia had, especially after Reza Shah's dictatorship. And the party very much basically tapped into that genuine desire. Later on, I think you get the development of ultra-leftism, I would say, where the notion becomes that these are bourgeois rights, that really in Marxism, these individual rights are not important. This is, I think, a misinterpretation of Marx. And I think the Tudeh party was more correct or more Marxist in the early period, stressing the individual rights. Because
so early and later, is there a particular event or a time that you feel gradually this change occurred? Because Iranians was the same too, by the way.
Yeah, I think by basically after 49, 50, 51, these ideas actually are dropped. And in fact, Mossad there becomes more associated with the constitutional rights. And the Tudeh party is much more interested about social economic rights, as if those rights trump individual rights. But I think for the earlier Tudeh party and also for Marx, individual rights are important. The social economic rights are also important because individual rights become meaningless if you don't have socioeconomic rights. But that doesn't mean that individual rights are just bourgeois, phony rights. And I think that was lost in the later period. And of course, when you come further into the 1960s and 70s, those, especially with the rise of Maoism, those individual rights become basically considered a sort of retrogressive and not important for progressive movements. So I think that loses sight of the Enlightenment.
Thank you. This is a great point. But one can make argument, or at least based on what I just heard, I'm now thinking of this, that the Tudor party in the beginning, starting in 41, so the leadership, the elite, that partly became leader of Tudor party, but Iranian elite generally were still inspired by the constitutional movement, right? Tudor party joined the government of Qavam. This is something that in the later on, probably the left would not have done. But even the elite, the government's elite, the Mohammad Reza Shah elite of the 40s and 50s were very different from the elites that joined Reza Shah and afterward. So there was a shift. Certainly, this is part of the left history, but even on the right, this also changed. It's very interesting that in the early period of Reza Shah, when Arani was publishing Dunya, Arani and Iskandari and Buzurg Alavi and others, they would review like books or a play or musical performance by people who were very close to Reza Shah government. But if they felt this was helpful for the society, they would review it in a very positive way. And vice versa, by the way.
Yeah. Significant actually phrasing Arani's defense in court, where he talks about, well, if the government wants to borrow things from the West, you can't just limit it to various things like the railways. You have to also take ideas. And of course,
he mentions Rousseau, for instance, and it's a very legalistic. This changed.
But I think what you also, later on, besides in the leftist movement turning into ultra-leftism, you also get something happening in Iran in the 60s and 70s, which, of course, you and others have very much talked about, is Garb Zadagi. So anything from the West, including individual rights.
Constitutional revolution becomes a big evil.
So there's a change in discourse. But in the 41-53 period, the discourse is still very much that of the Enlightenment. And the Tudeh party, I think, very much fitted into that discourse. So there was no basically seen as a conflict between what the Tudeh party was calling for and the whole generation of people who'd grown up on Kasravi and the Mashrutiyat period, thinking of what should be legitimate demands of political actors. I think also if in the Majlis, in the debates, when even pro-Shah people, they still actually talk in the language of the Enlightenment, of the Mashrutiyat.
And the fact that Majlis was central politics is very telling, right?
Yeah.